Hello everyone, good evening. Welcome to the dialogues. My name is Manas. I'm a doctoral student in the Department of HSS at IIT Gandhinagar. Today we have Professor Sudhir Kakar as our guest. He will be in a discussion with Dr. Anurag Mishra. I will briefly introduce the audience to both Professor Kakar and Dr. Mishra, and then I will hand the session over to Professor Orku Chattopadhyay, who will be moderating the entire event going forward. Professor Kakar is a psychoanalyst, a novelist, and a scholar in the fields of cultural psychology and psychology of religion. He has been a lecturer at the University of Harvard, a professor at IIM Ahmedabad, head of the Department of HSS at IIT Delhi, and a visiting professor at multiple universities across the world, such as Chicago, McGill, Melbourne, Vienna, Harvard, to name a few. He is the recipient of multiple honors, including the Bhabha, Nehru, and the ICSSR National Fellowships, the Kardiner Award of Columbia University, the Boyer Prize of the American Anthropological Association, the Lotte Koehler Prize, Germany's Goethe Medal, and the Order of Merit from the Republic of Germany. Professor Kakar is the author cum editor of 23 books of nonfiction and 7 of fiction. The Mind in the World, collected papers of Sudhir Kakar, in 4 volumes, will be published in spring 2022 by the Oxford University Press. His books have been translated into 22 languages around the world. In this vein, I would like to mention that here at this institute, we as students have been introduced to several of Professor Kakar's books as part of our history coursework. We have been thoroughly taught books like The Colors of Violence, published by the University of Chicago Press in 1996. I still vividly remember the chapter called The Riot in this particular book, and Ma'am was talking about that particular chapter a while back. I know my introduction is getting a bit longer. My apologies for that. There are several books by Professor Kakar that are available at the Institute Library for students to look into. I would like to mention a few of them. Culture and Psyche, the Selected Aces, second edition, published by the Oxford University Press in 1997. Kama Sutra, published in 2009 by the Oxford University Press and co-authored by Wendy Doniger. Inner World, a psychoanalytic study of childhood and society in India, third edition, published by the Oxford University Press in 2008. Book of Memory, Confessions and Reflection, published by Viking in 2011. Young Tagore, published by the Penguin Books in 2013. And lastly, Indians, Portrait of a People, published by the Penguin Books in 2007 and co-authored by Katharina Kakar. As I mentioned earlier, Professor Kakar will be in a discussion with Dr. Anurag Mishra. Dr. Mishra is a psychiatrist and psychoanalytical psychotherapist trained in India and in Europe. He is the founder of Psychoanalysis India, which helped to organize the international psychoanalytical conferences in Delhi, along with the annual Sigmund Freud talks. He is the founder of Livonics Publishing, which has been publishing books on psychoanalysis, mental health, organizational dynamics, and economics. He's also the founder of Livonics Infotech and the academic advisor to the University of Latvia International Institute of Indic Studies in Riga. He's also the co-editor of Psychoanalysis from India and Terror, along with Professor Anudhar and Mansi Kumar. With that being said, I would like to hand the event over to Professor Orku Chattopadhyay. Professor Chattopadhyay is a faculty in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at IIT Gandhinagar. Over to you, Professor. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Manas. And thank you, everyone, for joining us here in large numbers. And it's a great honor for us to have Professor Sudhir Kakar here with us. And it's really generous of Dr. Mishra to be in conversation with Sudhir Kakar, and that's how I reached out to Professor Kakar through Anurag, as I call him. And it's great that we have this conversation. I don't want to take a lot of time. I just want to begin perhaps opening up a few questions that might come back in course of this conversation with Professor Kakar. As I say in my course on cognitive philosophy and psychoanalysis, if the colonial chapter of psychoanalysis in India revolves around Girindra Shekhar Bose, the post-colonial chapter almost entirely revolves around Professor Kakar. And it's very interesting that we are, though this is a digital session, we are not very far from Ahmedabad. We are in Gujarat and we are in Gandhinagar. And that's where this historical chapter began in a way. As many of you would know, Professor Kakar used to be an engineering student in Ahmedabad. And that's where the interactions with Erik Erikson, if I'm not wrong, started, and the entire process of his psychoanalytic journey began. I just wanted to make a couple of observations, just as as a way of conversation starter, possibly for Dr. Mishra and Professor Kakar to get into this. It's very interesting. In fact, one of the things that Professor Kakar suggested initially, for this conversation was a question whether we should call it Indian psychoanalysis or psychoanalysis in India. And I would like to sort of go back to that question, because I think that question will become important and interesting in various ways, perhaps taking the mantle from Freud's late works, the last few books where Freud was clearly going towards a sociological, anthropological extension of psychoanalytic arguments. And especially I'm thinking of Moses and Monotheism, or Civilization and its Discontents, and definitely A Future of an Illusion, which is the book on religion, along with Moses and Monotheism. Perhaps taking a leaf out of that, if I may say, Professor Kakar, in a lifetime's work, has talked about the question of psychoanalysis in and through public culture. And specifically, he has talked about psychoanalysis in and through religion, public cultures of religion. I mean, Manas has already sort of opened it up. What is interesting here is this sort of, again, interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, whatever you want to call it, perspective that opens up not only a psychoanalytic sociology and anthropology, but as a sort of psychoanalysis, as a student of psychoanalysis, I would say, it also opens up, Professor Kakar's work opens up not only a psychoanalytic anthropology, but an anthropological and sociological psychoanalysis. And maybe we could talk about the reciprocity of this relation between sociology and anthropology on the one hand, and psychoanalysis on the other hand. The way Professor Kakar has addressed various questions, especially the question of communal strife, question of riots, around various notions of regression, for example, in psychoanalysis, and also the notion of death drive, the way he's talked about the child, if we go back to his earlier work, the inner world of the child in a specifically Hindu household, and generally speaking, the way he has culturalized psychoanalysis. Maybe we could also have a discussion about this, the very process of Indianizing psychoanalysis through public culture, because he has used psychoanalysis as a heuristic device to understand various public cultures, such as the question of mysticism, for example, or the question of love, question of sexuality that he has engaged with at length. I won't take more time. It's over to both of you now, Dr. Mishra and Professor Kakar, and I'm really eager to listen to this conversation. Thank you so much for making it today.
Thank you, Arka. Could you unmute Professor Kakar? There, I see you now, sir. So, thank you, Arka. And I feel a bit like, in an arranged marriage setting, when the boy and the bride, the prospective bridegroom and the girl are supposed to now talk after you have explained how they are going to get married. But having said that, we shall do our best to converse politely while the rest of you look on. So thank you for the introduction. You made a comprehensive introduction, actually, to Sudhir Kakar's work. But he also holds the distinction of probably being the only psychoanalyst to not only have his effigy burnt, but also the effigies of his books burnt in Delhi, along with fervent prayers that Bhagwan, that is God, should give him Sanmati, good sense. That's as famous as you get to be in the world of psychoanalysis and writing. As an author, one wishes that people who would actually, people who burn their books would actually buy them before burning them, rather than making effigies of the books. But such good fortune only lies at the fatwa level of being famous. So I was introduced to Sudhir Kakar's work 25 years ago in Ahmedabad, actually, as an interview in Gentleman magazine. I don't know whether any of you have ever encountered that magazine. It might have been before most of your time. And in the course of that interview, Sudhir was, and his interviewer, I don't know whether you remember that interview, sir. You have been interviewed, probably you're the most interviewed psychoanalyst in the world that I can think of. But in the course of that interview, you and your interviewer were talking about the travails of sexuality in India over what I presumed was to be a single malt in the garden of your Delhi house. But here we are, 25 years later, but without the single malt. My apologies for that. And I presume we are in Gujarat, so we shouldn't talk more about that. The Sudhir has been the debonair, suave gentleman of Indian psychoanalysis, as comfortable in the clinic and university as in the society of the rich, beautiful, and powerful, where he has represented psychoanalysis and India, sometimes one, sometimes the other, sometimes both, and sometimes invited the likes of this interviewer to such glamorous company as well, for which I am thankful, sir. One should, and this is a piece of advice to all of you, one should choose one's guru with care and do as I do. So on that note, I shall introduce two other drinks to this already whiskey-tinged conversation before I ask sir to comment. The first one being milk and the other wine, which wine I'll leave till the end. That would be better, I think. But in his autobiography, which you mentioned, a book of memory, confessions, and reflections. I mean, what better way to describe psychoanalysis, actually? Memory, confessions, and reflections. He mentions that he didn't speak till the age of 5 years because he didn't see the need to. Till at breakfast one day, he proclaimed that I want chocolate in my milk. You know, in psychoanalysis, when you're having a session, you often pay great attention to what a patient starts off the session with, because it often indicates what the rest of the session is going to be about. It also indicates, there aren't many clinicians here, but it also indicates, you know, the transference, counter-transference access from the previous session on which the session revolves. So at 5 years of age, sir had his tryst with destiny. 4 years before Nehruji made his famous speech. So he preempted him from Red Fort. So after not speaking for 5 years, he proceeded to make up for it to such an extent that I believe that your Festschrift is now being compiled into 6 volumes, all addressing different aspects of his work. And in fact, I think, I may be wrong, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you are the one who coined the word transcultural. Am I right? Well, that's my understanding. It would, so I will not attempt to do the futile. I will not try and touch even briefly on the many aspects of his voluminous work. What I will try and do is focus briefly on the chocolate and the milk. You know, the interdisciplinary, the transdisciplinary, the trans, which actually refers to the trance, which he refers to and often, you know, says something about. So there is this famous story of this Persian king who landed off the shore of Gujarat, and, you know, when the king said that, you know, and he's concerned about all these Persians landing on the coast and whether they would cause trouble, he said that, you know, I'm going to be like sugar in milk. I will spread only sweetness and not be visible, you know, in your society. Sir has proceeded to mix chocolate in milk for more than 50 years, which we have drunk very gratefully. So whether it is psychoanalytic chocolate in Indian milk or vice versa, we'll see. But he likes to imagine himself as occupying the space, in his own words, between the mud and the lotus. And there in the stem, he's the lightning rod for inspiration. And this is the one sentence which I love the most of Sir's writing. Other people have their favorites. And he has famously said that he imagines the unconscious as an engine which travels on the twin tracks of the spirit and the divine, and empathy and the meditative state which underlies it as the sluice through which the spiritual enters the room. So with that long prologue, I would like to ask you, sir, about something which Arka mentioned, in the beginning. What is the, role of fate or luck in your life? I mean, what are the chances of luck? What are the chances that probably the only two German speakers in Ahmedabad bumped into each other? When you met Erikson at your aunt's house, when he had traveled to Ahmedabad to research the book on Gandhi, and how has that fateful encounter, reverberated or not in your life?
Okay. First of all, let me thank all of you, all the speakers before. The introductions were much too generous. They make me frightened to go on further. But thank you again. And since we started with Ahmedabad and you asked about Ahmedabad, Ahmedabad actually was the first city where they burned the book, and where they had actually, I thought they were very, very smart. In fact, not only smart, very, very witty, because what they had in the procession was a donkey in front with a placard saying, Kakar ko sanmati de Bhagwan, because the book was on Gandhi at that time. So I thought that was very witty. So as long as if you are defamed, if it is done with wit, I always enjoy it. So, sorry to say that. Sorry, you can hear me or?
Yes, so we can hear you.
All right, okay. Yes, that was complete luck. There are some who know it already, and that is a problem if I think I have talked too much in my so many years before. I've stopped talking that much now, but giving talks. So people have heard it already, or many have. It was complete luck of the meeting with Erikson. It is not only the two German speakers, but it was with a young man who was having an identity crisis, meeting a person who had coined the term identity crisis. So that was the biggest thing, because any other person in your profession, Anurag, psychiatrist, he would have said, this is a pathology. It is completely who has no idea where he wants to, what to do. One day he says he wants to be a film director. The other day he wants to be a writer. He has absolutely no idea. He doesn't want to settle down. My God, he's 28. He doesn't want to settle down, doesn't want to get married. There is something very much wrong. But identity crisis, as Erikson's was, that it is also always an opportunity also. So it is not only a crisis, means both. So that was the lucky part, that he understood me. And I think the talking of the German helped a lot there, because he was alone there, and I was lonely. I was not alone in Ahmedabad, but I'd come back after 5 years from Germany. So I was lonely. And there was a man who I didn't know who he was, because as I said, I confused him with Erich Fromm, who I'd heard of, but not of Erik Erikson at that time. And so I couldn't talk anything. And there was this gentleman listening, and I felt myself so understood. And that is when I said, I decided, this is what I want to be. This is what he does. And he's a psychoanalyst. I'm going to be that. And then I've told the story of the complete luck of he had left Ahmedabad. He had gone to, for the younger students who don't know that story. So I was in IIM Ahmedabad at that time as a research fellow. And he had left Ahmedabad after research on his Gandhi book and gone back to Delhi. And he was leaving next day for the US. And there was no way to reach him, because the train took 24 hours. He would have gone. But luckily, again, luck, the IIM Ahmedabad was financed in his foreign exchange dealings by the Ford Foundation. And Ford Foundation at that time was a very colonial viceroy kind of in the educational affairs of India. So its representative had a private plane, and he had come down to Ahmedabad in his small plane, and he was going back that evening. And I picked up the courage and went to him and said, "Can I catch a lift with you to Delhi?" And he said, "Yes, come on." So I landed up in Erickson's room at 11 o'clock at night in the India International Center, knocked at his door and said, "I want to be what you are." And he said, he smiled and yes, come in. And what do you mean by that? And I said, I've adopted you as my guru, so I'm going to be a psychoanalyst like you. And he said, but you've never studied psychology. I said, no, absolutely not.
Minor problem.
But he said, well, doesn't matter, neither have I. Because he had all his degree was a high school diploma, and then he had become a wandering artist till he came to Freud's household and came into psychoanalysis. So he was this big professor at Harvard, one of the most famous one, who didn't even have a bachelor's degree. So that was also luck to meet that kind of a professor who, because he says what is important for a psychoanalyst is not what you studied, but whether you are psychologically minded. And that you are, because I'd written short stories in German and I'd given it to read. And he said, those stories show a psychological mindedness, and then we will arrange it. So that is the luck, not just the German speaker, but a man who knew what an identity crisis possibilities were, and not only pathologizing that, also somebody who had a much greater view of what psychology can be and what is required to be a psychologist. So all those kind of things one wouldn't find. And of course, that he had such a high position in Harvard that he could manage it. I mean, I became a lecturer at Harvard. I had to take a doctorate degree, which was in economics in Vienna, to go there. But to kind of persuade a university to give me a lecturer's position So all that luck is, I cannot imagine what I would have been doing otherwise now. So that was...
Two things I recognize, which I have inherited, is a good taste in gurus, and the fact that you adopt a guru rather than the guru adopting you. You adopt a guru and say, "Hey, you are my guru. I have adopted you as a guru." Right?
Yeah.
But also that Erickson, he was really a man of his word. I mean, he said that
I would, and yeah. And of course, when I wrote to him, then of course I have no money. So of course, as I have adopted you as guru, I sent him that story of Dronacharya and Eklavya, without knowing what it meant. But of course, what I was saying is, don't treat me like that. I'm that kind of a person. I'm not a Harvard rich person. He, of course, understood, but he never commented it. He just wrote to me, "No, we don't have that kind of money to support you, but I'll get you some money from Harvard." So, yeah.
And what was surprising also was that he was so open to, your transference. I mean, if one can call it that, of being adopted as a guru. He was not the, traditional Western analyst which you met later on in your life. He was open to being the guru to you, which would probably would have been an unusual experience for him as well.
Yes, and that he could be open to that experience, because the guru experience is not that easy to bear for the guru. It is easy if the guru is not a reflective one, because all kind of the positive transferences which is coming to you from all your chelas who are saying, "Oh, you are perfect, you are wonderful." I mean, no, everyone, it's very difficult to reject all of them. Every time somebody is saying you are wonderful, so one starts believing after a while that you are wonderful, unless it's only the negative ones which you guard against. If somebody is saying you are bad, then immediately there's a resistance. So to have those positive things directed at you, and still not reject them, but keep them aside, this is not really true. This is a transference. It's a difficult task. And most gurus, unfortunately, fall prey to it, to this very positive, idealizing transferences from their shishyas. They start believing that it is true, that it is not an idealizing transference, but it is the truth. which of course then leads to problems.
Right. You have, I think somewhere, I forget where, and this is a problem with interviewing you or talking with you, because as Auden said about Freud, that he is a climate of opinion. I've, grown up reading your work so much, so I don't know where I'm referencing what from. But somewhere you have talked about Erikson's noble fourfold path, which his way of doing psychohistory, which, many respects is your way of doing psychohistory also. And since we are talking about gurus and we're talking about noble fourfold paths, we also, very few people have, actually listened to Erikson speak. I did try to put up a few videos of him, which you gave me on our YouTube channel, but they were put down by some institute in America claiming it to be their own. But what came across was this, that here was this very wise person, which is something that you only occasionally get when you speak to people in psychoanalysis. And that's maybe also another question of the relationship between wisdom and psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic knowledge and practice. Why does it dawn on so few? And what is our relationship to psychoanalytic wisdom? But these questions you may put to the side because they are really, they require a more peaceful surrounding possibly to address. But for the people here, since Arka has instructed us to be a bit more instructional, what about Erikson's noble fourfold path, which, it's really sad, I'm talking too much, but it's really sad that I'll come to the other part, that how Erikson is taught, not taught, etc. But many people might not have heard about this noble fourfold path, and maybe you can say a few words about it.
Erikson doesn't talk about as the same way noble fourfold path. His is that how does in psychoanalysis, how does one derive meaning from what you are hearing of an event in a person's life? What is the meaning? And then he gives that that you should look at what did this event mean in the person's life history. This is what normally psychoanalysts do. They go back to the childhood and go further. What did it mean, this person in your life?
Psychoanalyst.
That was an echo. That was an echo.
Oh, that was an echo. Okay. So the psychoanalyst looks at it and says, what did it mean in the person's life history? Any event in your life. Then you look at what does it mean at the stage of life at this particular time, because meanings of events change whether you are a 7-year-old or a 50-year-old. So what does it mean now at this stage of life where the demands on your psyche and on yourself are different? You are no longer, for instance, if as an 18-year-old struggling with identity, but you are in the stage much later of, say, as a father or as a mother, so with children. So then that event means very different, the same event. And the third is, what did it mean in the group of which you are a part, the community of which you are a part? And here what culture comes in. And I think from this, what at the beginning was said, we can go into what is being asked for us of culture, psychoanalysis, Indian psychoanalysis. So this was the third one. What did it mean in the culture of the community? And the fourth one was, what does it mean in the history of the community? So all those four things, if you look at an event, what you call the configuration of meanings of those four, would then give you some idea of what that event really means in the person's life.
Why do you think, that Erikson is taught so little, and his insights, which are, very wise, are taught so little in psychoanalytic institutes? I mean, in his heyday, I mean, when you were there in Harvard, I mean, he was a star. I mean, from what I hear, all students would flock to his lectures. The lecture halls would be full. But after some time has passed, that what happened? Why is he not being talked about more? Why is he not being taught more?
I think that there are two things in it. One is he never established a school.
Mm-hmm.
And the people who are talked of in psychoanalysis are always known as who have established the Kohutian school for Kohut, Winnicottian, etc., etc. So there was never establishment of a school because he stayed away from organized psychoanalysis, more or less. He was at its very respected at its fringes. I mean, he gave the opening or the keynote one in this 1977 one, but he was not accepted as one of them. He was much more accepted than in the universities and in the general public than in psychoanalytic institutes. And one must also think of it that it was American psychoanalysis at its heyday of power, who were mostly psychiatrists who were psychiatric institutes. He was not a psychiatrist also. So those are some of the reasons. But there is often there's so many actually who have been influenced by him, because I remember sitting in small seminars with him of especially, well, I wouldn't names, that doesn't matter. But I think what we should do is really come and go towards the third part of it, psychoanalysis and culture, so that, and then Indian, because otherwise, I mean, I could go on talking of, I love to talk on. And also, I mean, one must say it, you can still admire a person without idealizing him. So I admire him greatly. I do not idealize him because he had his difficulties, as his daughter wrote after he had died. He was very empathetic with his patients, with people who came, could understand them, but he was terrible with the family in the sense that he couldn't understand. He always withdrew from the family. And his daughter remembers him somebody asking, "How are you?" Him passing it on to his wife and saying, "Joan, how are we?" Okay.
So as indicated by you, I shall move on to empathy. Yeah, you want to say something?
No, only because since we were going to talk of Indian psychoanalysis, and I was asking earlier which is the audience, and I think it may be better first to say what I think are the foundations of psychoanalysis, and so not go into what psychoanalysis, all its complexities and models, and then go into how the culture would influence these foundations, and how then an Indian psychoanalysis or in India would influence these things. Now, if you are okay with that, then we could do that, but you can in the middle, whenever I'm saying something, yeah.
Let me introduce what you're going to say with 2 lines, because when we were trying to come up with a topic for today's discussion, Arka said, Sudhir Kakar, psychoanalysis. We were discussing, or rather, Arka was discussing whether it is psychoanalysis from India or Indian psychoanalysis, and I said that neither of these are appropriate, and you can maybe call it the idealization of the guru. But I said the psychoanalysis of Sudhir Kakar. That why is it that when somebody in the West talks about psychoanalysis, it's like psychoanalysis for the whole world, and when Sudhir Kakar talks about psychoanalysis, it has to be prefixed or whatever by India. And then I later realized that maybe it should not even be the psychoanalysis of Sudhir Kakar, but what I felt after thinking a bit was that what you had actually laid out in your works was a kind of ethics of Sudhir Kakar, more than even the psychoanalytical ethics of Sudhir Kakar. But I will stop at that and let you have the floor about Indian psychoanalysis from India, or whatever else you think is the right way to address this.
Yeah. Well, first I want to give my understanding of what I think is the essence of psychoanalysis. And those are three basic assumptions. One is the role of the unconscious in personality, development of personality, behavior, and the role of the unconscious and its relationship with the conscious, often in conflict. So the great importance of unconscious. Now this, for a long time, psychoanalysis, Freudian psychoanalysis, and others also, in fact, psychoanalysis, I would say, was the only proponent of the great role of unconscious in human life. This has, of course, now been changing, as you all know. Psychologists have also turned their attentions to unconscious determinants of behavior and have come up with extremely interesting findings on unconscious processes and relations between conscious and unconscious. Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel laureate for economics in 2004, refers to use the terms system 1 and system 2 rather than unconscious and conscious of everyday speech. So much of research has been not only interesting, but very useful. Even in philosophy, I hope it is changing, but what I'm saying is in psychology and economics, it is coming very, very much to the forefront, the importance of the unconscious. In philosophy, I think David Hume was isolated when he wrote that reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions, and can never pretend to any other office than to serve and obey them. But I think more and more people are realizing, and the extreme view would be, that one of the main functions of conscious reasoning is to rationalize our choices that we have unconsciously made. We use reason to convince ourselves and persuade others that our actions are right. I think Jonathan Haidt, a social psychologist, has a very nice phrase for it: the emotional tail wags the rational dog. So that is the one part of a basic assumption of psychoanalysis, as the role and the importance of unconscious processes. And the second is early childhood. The great importance of early childhood in development of personality and its influence on adult behavior. Here, I think psychoanalysis has received great support in the middle. I won't go into this kind of a talk of what are in various disciplines, whether neurosciences, psychology, which support psychoanalytic and where they do not support. But the importance of early childhood in personality development is, I think, now quite universally established, and that is one of the basic assumptions. So psychoanalysis believes that each one of us has only a few psychological themes that run throughout our lives, which are repeated again and again in forms suitable to our stage of life. A little girl weeps quite differently than an adult woman, but on whichever theme is running. Since I have a great interest in literature, and I think literature and psychoanalysis are very intimately bound, or should be. So the writer, the Sri Lankan writer, I think, who lives in Canada, Michael Ondaatje, so he states this theme of repetition of themes from early childhood. And I'm going to quote them. Let me read. We live with those retrievals from childhood that coalesce and echo throughout our lives. The way shattered pieces of glass in a kaleidoscope reappear in new forms and are song-like in their refrains and rhymes, making up a single monologue. We live permanently in the recurrence of our stories, whatever story we tell. So psychological pain, according to psychoanalysis, is a consequence of one of our stories, and which does not need to be first eliminated, but understood. So essential to psychoanalysis is the view that process of self-understanding, of insight into those themes from childhood, of coming to know oneself, or even attempting to do so, is essential to the restoration of well-being. And third, desire. Karma, I would like to call it more, the role of desire, eros, in human life. Of course, Freudian is also the second instinct, aggression, but I'm much more interested in the role of eros, or desire. Yeah. And this, I think, if one looks at so much of the Indian culture, especially the Hindu-Indian culture of the past, how great importance the karma has received. What I'm going to do is give you a quote. No, well, I'll tell you. Now, Krishnamurti, Jiddu Krishnamurti, who was a very well-known spiritual teacher and philosopher, and when he talks about his own teachings, he seems to be equally speaking of what a psychoanalyst would say about desire. Again, a small quote from him. Now, desire, contrary to general belief, is the most precious possession of man. It is the eternal flame of life. It is life itself. When its nature and functions are not understood, however, it becomes cruel, tyrannical, bestial, stupid. Therefore, your business is not to kill desire, as most spiritual people in the world are trying to do, but to understand it. If you kill your desire, you are like the withered branch of a lovely tree. Desire must keep growing and find out its true meaning through conflict and friction. Only by the continuance of the conflict can understanding come. This is what most people do not see. As soon as the conflict comes and the sorrow born of conflict, they at once seek comfort. Comfort in its turn breeds fear. Fear leads to imitation and the sheltering behind established tradition. From this come rigid systems of morality, laying down what is spiritual, what is not spiritual, what is religious life and what is not religious life. It is the fear of life itself which produces guides, teachers, gurus, churches, religions. Please, I know. I don't think any psychoanalyst can better state this third importance. So these, to me, are the basic three assumptions of psychoanalysis. Now, the rest of the superstructure which has been built up, there are many things in it which, when you look at it, are really assumptions, ideas located very much in a post-Enlightenment Western middle class of the 20th century, as if the middle class man, European middle class man, is the only what is called person, and all the rest are a deviation. And there are many from what is family, what is the whole idea of what is culture, of what is central human experiences, what is good, what is evil, what is real, what is unreal, what is the essential nature of men and women and the world they live in, what is a person's connection to nature, to other human beings, and to cosmos. So much of this, or almost all of these, have very much are influenced by the culture. In fact, in psychoanalysis, Freud talks of, I think everyone knows his division into ego, id, and superego. And ego is his, when he talks of the ego and the id, the ego is the representative or introduces what is called the reality principle or the reality. But if you look at what reality is almost completely cultural. So what we believe in is very much a matter of the culture which we have, which we are growing in, and there's are any civilizations of vision of reality even plays a role in how it organizes knowledge, how it shapes the processes of attention, perception, reasoning, inference making. Again, talked of it like the Miller-Lyer illusion, where lines of equal length give impressions of different length, which is an illusion created by the orientation of the arrows caps placed at their ends. I don't know if you have seen them, I'm sure you have. So as the analyst Margulis observes, our cultural environment in its everyday structures, practices, and aesthetics shapes the way our brains process visual information. And if this is true for neurobiological, non-conscious visual processing, it seems almost certain it would be true for psychoanalytically relevant unconscious processes and the impact of culture. But I think, Anurag, what culture is, you have used a very, very felicitous term, the terroir. And if you can kind of let us know of the differences, cultural differences and psychoanalysis in the use of your term, terroir.
It's interesting because there is a story which lies behind it. I remember I was in France and I'd come down for breakfast, and in breakfast I had cheese, and for the first time in my life I could taste the grass that the cow must have eaten to produce the milk from which the cheese was made. And at that moment I thought, till now my life has been a pasteurized waste. So I was interested always in wine, and anybody who's interested in wine knows that, either there is a wine of terroir or there is Coca-Cola. A wine of terroir is a wine which expresses, the place where it is from, that particular hillside, that particular soil, that particular year, and you can taste all that in that sip of wine, right? So, and it's the same thing with psychoanalysis, or for that matter, any artistic or creative venture, that either it is an expression of terroir, that when you listen to it, when you experience it, you get a sense of time, place, and probably there's a phrase in Sanskrit about it, which Sir always says, and I forget, Kal and so on and so forth, of that, where it is coming from. Or it is Coca-Cola. And so Sir's work is like that he has been, and there is another story behind that. In 2009, I met another famous analyst, Andre Green, who was very different from Sir in nature. And I was listening to his talk, and then I went to him and I asked him a question about how do you think psychoanalysis should be taught? And he immediately said, psychoanalysis cannot be taught. And then it was a challenge to me, and then he gave me a long look to see he liked challenging people. So he gave me a long look to see what I would make of it. And somewhere out of some depth, which I was not aware of, I said, yes, I can't be taught. You have to be a vigneron of psychoanalysis, that you have to make a good wine out of psychoanalysis. And then much later, in another terroir in South Africa, I referred to Sir as, the vigneron of Indian psychoanalysis, that he has produced a fine psychoanalytic wine. Since at least 50 years, you have been nurturing this wine. You have been looking after it, adding to it, complexity after complexity, book after book for so many years. And now, we have this wine, but the question again remains, how does one pass on this wisdom or this winemaking that you have done for 50 years, which we are trying to somehow identify with? How does one, pass on this wisdom? In what way can we pass it on? Because, you are not an obsessive methodological inventor, as you yourself say somewhere, that you and Erickson have this thing in common, that you see patterns, you see patterns, and both of you, like the Buddha, talk through stories of other people, and people grasp this and that out of your stories. But how do we pass on the skill of imparting wisdom through stories rather than obsessive methodologizing, if I can use that word?
Yeah, I think your term of the terroir was a very welcome and a good one. And I think what it does say that, which I've just said, that we need to recognize that many psychoanalytic propositions on what constitutes, for instance, psychological maturity, gender appropriate behaviors, positive or negative resolutions of developmental conflicts and complexes that often appear in the garb of universal truths are actually, as I said, the incorporation of Western middle class experience and values into psychoanalytic theory. Fundamental ideas about human relationships, family, marriage, male, female, and so on, which are essentially cultural in origin, often remain unexamined and are regarded universally valued. And psychoanalysis had started very much so. I think it has started changing, but I think it is one of the last disciplines which still has an aspiration of being a universal, applicable to everyone. I think it needs to change from universal to global, which means those, not that you saying the basic assumptions of psychoanalysis, those are the universal, that is probably the essence, but then the water, the soil, where it comes into, which country it comes into, or which civilization it comes into, needs to then change it into that particular country. And we know that is happening. It happened in Latin America, where the importance of those times in Brazil, Argentina, of the dictatorships, etc., where it changed psychoanalysis. Now you talk about Latin American, they talk about Latin American psychoanalysis, and in fact, and then I would even talk about French psychoanalysis, which is different. But perhaps we need to look at universals not as what is shared, but what we should have in common. And that is always then a conversation. Are the French revolutions, fraternity, égalité, liberty, the three, are they universals? Should be. And that is then always a conversation between cultures. But so what is universal is not what is, but what is desirable. And we know that it is not only psychoanalysis, that all modern psychotherapies and most psychologies we teach in our universities that need to go through the crucible of different human cultures. There's for probably students know it already, but I would again mention this very, very, not only interesting, but very, very influential paper by the Harvard psychologist Hinrich called Weird, where he says that all of our psychological knowledge comes from a small subset of the human population, which he called Weird. Weird stands for, the acronym Weird stands for W for Western, E for educated, I for industrialized, R for rich, and D for democratic. And that it is a small group of statistical outliers that provide us with both the producers and subjects of our contemporary psychological knowledge. We then blithely proceed to generalize to the rest of humankind, and which is also true of psychoanalysis, I'm afraid. Jonathan Haidt, who I mentioned before, so he demonstrates the chasm between weird and others in his study of morality. So where he interviewed 12 groups of different social classes in different countries. So he tells each interviewee different stories and then asks if there is something wrong in how someone acts in the story, and if so, why is it wrong? So one of the story goes, a man goes to the supermarket once a week and buys a chicken. But before cooking the chicken, he has sexual intercourse with it. Then he cooks it and eats it. So one of his groups was from students of the University of Pennsylvania, liberal Ivy League college in the United States, and certainly the most weird among the selected groups. This was the only group out of the 12 where a majority, 73%, tolerated the chicken story, finding it okay. It's his chicken, it's dead, nobody is getting hurt, and it is being done in private. So the way human beings feel, think, act cannot be divorced from the cultural context, as Anurag has also just pointed out. I can of course give the example of very kind of fundamental things in psychoanalysis. One is what is called separation individuation, separating from the family psychically also, and separation individuation in the Indian Hindu cultural imagination, separation from the family, and not only I think this is pan-Indian, also other groups. So separation from the family is not looked upon in the same way as in North European and North American cultures. So a thoughtful Indian may agree with Freud's opening sentence in Family Romances 1919, I quote him, "The separation of the individual as he grows up from the authority of the parents is one of the most necessary achievements of his development, yet at the same time, one of the most painful." So a thoughtful Indian will agree with it as long as the words "is one of the most necessary achievements" was omitted. The Indian cultural position, or the Hindu Indian cultural position, is exemplified in the myth of Ganesha, which you all know. And the dramatist persona in this version of the myth from South India and Sri Lanka are Mahadevi in her form of Shiva's wife, Uma, Ganesha, and his younger brother Skanda, the god of heroic exploits. So a mango was floating down the stream, and Uma, the mother, said that whoever rides around the universe first will get the mango. Skanda impulsively got on his golden peacock and went around the universe. But Ganesha, who wrote The Rat, had more wisdom. He thought, what could my mother have meant by this? He then circumambulated his mother, worshipped her, and said, I have gone around my universe. Since Ganesha was right, his mother gave him the mango. Skanda was furious when he arrived and demanded the mango. But before he could get it, Ganesha bit the mango and broke one of his tusks. So here Skanda and Ganesha are personifications of the two opposing wishes of the older child. It is torn between a powerful push for independent and autonomous functioning and an equally strong pull towards surrender and re-immersion in the enveloping maternal fusion from which it has just emerged. Giving in to the pull of individuation and independence, Skanda becomes liable to one kind of punishment, exile from the mother's bountiful presence, and one kind of reward, the promise of functioning as an adult virile man. Going back to the mother, and I would view Ganesha's eating of the mango as a return to and feeding at the breast, especially since we know that in Tamil Nadu, the analogy between mango and the breast is a matter of common awareness, has the broken tusk, the loss of potential masculinity as a consequence. Remaining an infant, Ganesha's reward, on the other hand, will be never to know the pangs of separation from the mother, never to feel the despair at her absence. That Ganesha's lot is considered superior to Skanda's is an indication of the Indian cultural preference in the dilemma of separation individuation. So while the Indian vision does not doubt the reality of separation, it refuses to admit that separation individuation is the highest level of reality. Instead, the Indian vision of reality emphasizes union and oneness. Consider here the Punjabi proverb about death. It is like being shifted from one breast of the mother to the other. The child feels lost for that instant, but not for long. What stands out in this proverb is that it is the continuation of breastfeeding rather than the aspiration of weaning and independence implicit in weaning that dominates the Indian imagination. Thus, one might say, and this is, I have it, and thankful to Erickson's teaching, of that between a minimum of separation individuation, sorry, small puppies came in, out. Between a minimum of separation individuation needed to function as an adult in a particular society and a maximum which cuts off all ties with family and community, there's a range of positions, all of which should be recognized by psychoanalysis as part of being human, rather than closely identifying with any particular position on the continuum as the only one that is healthy and mature. In fact, it's very interesting. I got a mail very recently from an anthropologist friend from Oslo who says that he spent quite a time recently talking with Chinese psychoanalytic trainees who are training mostly online with experienced analysts who are based in Europe and North America. China has become a very good market for psychoanalysts, especially from North America, where the psychoanalytic business is not that strong, let's put it. So he says that the idea that European psychoanalysis has a very normative view over separation and desirability of being attached in a particular way keeps coming up. I'm quoting him. I'm particularly struck by the way in which the European analysts are rather painfully obsessed by the idea that they do not understand the Chinese mind and whether they are agents of a psychological colonialism. And yet at the same time, they repeatedly talk about the failure to properly separate or incomplete separation of Chinese patients from their parents. And then he goes on to say that as he's an anthropologist, that I find the lack of connection that they draw here remarkable. The inability to see that describing Chinese separation from parents or the wider extended family as incomplete might itself be an example of the ethnocentric or even colonial attitude that they endlessly wonder and worry might be at the heart of their training. I don't know how much time we have. Actually, no, we have very little time, isn't it? Hello?
Sir, I never worry about such things. Please.
No, but we have.
That's all right, Mr. Kakar. I think you can go on for another 10 to 15 minutes and then we'll open it up for question answers.
All right. Okay, I'll just give another example because those are very kind of basis on the in the foundations of psychoanalysis. For instance, male and female differentiation. Now, Freud was very much aware of what he called the bisexuality. I mean, that is one of the, I think, great achievements of psychoanalysis, of the existence of bisexuality. And I think here we should go back to that, in fact, Bose in 1929, Girindra Shekhar Bose, the founder of Indian Psychoanalytic Society, in 1922, this is the 100th year, he was the first, not Western, non-Western, but the first analyst to raise the issue of the cultural relativism. It was when he wrote to Freud that the desire to be female is more easily unearthed in Indian male patients than in European. Now, the conversation did not go further. Freud was, I think, a bit quite dismissive. He was very polite, but essentially dismissive. It was never, conversation was never pursued very much. And I think Anurag mentioned it. And it's such a pity that the early, that generation of psychoanalysts, they were, when you read their papers, there is a sense of discovery, a sense of innovation when they're finding out in Indian data, clinical and cultural methodology, etc., all about what confirms psychoanalysis, what may differ from it, and that it all finished in, I would say, with Bose's death, 47, 48, Indian independence. And I for a long time, and I felt with the independence of India, the colonial mindset became even stronger somehow, that he completely wanted to join the global or the universal aspirations of the universal world. But that is somewhere else. But let's come back to this. So as I said, Bose already wrote in 1929 that desire to be female. And indeed, the easier access into awareness of the wish to female is not only to be found in male patients, but it is ubiquitous in Indian cultural imagination. Now, the reason why we speak of cultural imagination in conjunction with clinical work when discussing the role of culture in the formation of psyche is simple. Clinical psychoanalysis is generally limited to a small sample from 3 or 4 large Indian metropolises. It cannot adequately take into account the heterogeneity of a country of over 1 billion people with its regional, linguistic, religious, and caste divisions. Clinical cases can at best generate hypotheses about cultural particularities. The further testing of these hypotheses is done and remains true to psychoanalytic intention and enterprise by testing them in the crucible of the culture's imagination, myths, folklore, proverbs, art, fiction, cinema, and so on, before psychoanalytic proposition about a culture can be advanced. In clinical work, of course, one becomes aware how an individual's cultural imagination, her civilizational heritage, has been modified by the specific cultures of the family, of her family, caste, class, or ethnic group. The modern Indian who forms the bulk of the clientele for psychoanalytic therapy is attracted to the analytic vision in part because they view psychoanalysis as an ally for the realization of their autonomous individuality. But the interest of the modern Indian in individual autonomy does not mean that the Indian civilizational vision has disappeared from their psyche. Just as we talk about an intergenerational transmission of trauma, we need to be aware of a pre-conscious or unconscious intergenerational transmission of culture. The future of the modern Indian too will continue to have an ancient heart. So in the Indian context, the theme of bisexuality is ubiquitous in individual narratives and in popular myths, which are both more closely interwoven in Indian culture than is the case in the modern West. Oedipus is not actually, is a Freudian myth than any, one could say that it's a European, modern European or an American myth. It is more interest to psychoanalysis, psychoanalysts, literary theorists, mythologists, rather than having an influence on ordinary lives or its use in ordinary conversations and in psyche, as myths do in India. They're very different. Myths are very much, are not a part of bygone era. So they're not retained fragments from infantile psychic life, as one of the psychoanalysts called them, or vestiges of infantile fantasies of whole nations, in Freud's words. They are vibrantly alive. Symbolic power is intact. They constitute a cultural idiom which aids the individual in the construction and integration of the inner world. You know, say, usne us time ye kiya tha, when you, even in talk, whichever are the movements, whether it is even feminism, you go back to the Draupadi, there's always something to pick up, it becomes alive. Thus, for instance, Mahatma Gandhi in 1943 publicly proclaims that he has mentally become a woman, or quite unaware of Karen Horney and other deviants from the orthodox analytic position of the time, talks of man's envy of the woman's procreative capacities, saying, and I quote him, there's as much reason for a man to wish that he was born of a woman as for a woman to do otherwise. This is from Harijan in 1940. So he's sure of a sympathetic and receptive audience brought up on the Hindu-Indian myths of bisexuality. So I won't go into the myths, I mean, or into iconic forms, the Ardhanarishwara, etc. We won't go into all of that, but another example, of course, is visual, of course, is when you look at Greek or Roman sculpture with their hard muscle men's bodies at chests without any fat at all, familiar to most Europeans from childhood visits to museums or reproduced in countless visual mediums, and compare it with the sculpted representations of Hindu gods in the temples or the Buddha, where the bodies are often softer, suppler, and in their hint of breasts nearer to the female form. So again, one could use the same thing, that between a minimum of sexual differentiation needed to function heterosexually with a modicum of pleasure, and a maximum which cuts off any sense of empathy and emotional contact with the other sex that is experienced as a different species altogether. There's a whole range of positions, all of which should be recognized by psychoanalysis as part of being human, rather than closely identifying with any particular position on the continuum as the only one which is, healthy and mature. I think Anurag would agree, since we only have very few 10 minutes left, and we've actually just started on the conversation, that perhaps we should finish. But first, your reaction, Anurag, and because I was told that we should leave some time for questions also.
We had
and I have to leave at 6:32.
Yeah. So, this the relationship between identity and empathy and spirituality is interesting. That empathy does require a loosening of the corset of your identity, whether as a man or a woman or as an analyst or whatsoever, which is why your work has also been interesting, because you have been so many things. You have been an engineer, a business guru, an economist, an analyst, an author, and so on and so forth. That this in-betweenism.
It's always been identity confusion. So,
but this in-betweenism has helped with empathy and compassion. But we can go on gossiping, I suspect, but we should open it for the audience. They have a little time. They probably want to say something to you or ask you something. Madhumita, I think.
Yes, thank you so much. I would really love to have some more questions. I'm sure people are eagerly waiting to address the questions to both of you. So can we have some questions? Orko, would you like to take over from here, and then maybe Orko?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Thank you so much. That was such an engaging discussion. I was wondering if we could go on forever, but I know we can't. So, I mean, instead of maybe asking a question myself, I'd like to throw it open first. There were some very interesting points there. Personally speaking, I would like to know a little bit more about the connection between religion and psychoanalysis and your current position on it, Professor Kakar, because this is something that you've been working on, and I've followed that work to whatever extent I could.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering if your position has changed since the last book that I read on this topic was the 2007 book on mysticism, The Analyst and the Mystic. and the readings of Ramakrishna, for example, the readings of the spiritual experience there. And I was just wondering, I mean, in terms of the cultures of healing that inform your work, whether it's the study of fundamentalism, religious fundamentalism, or the study of mysticism and its relation with psychoanalysis. And I remember that that concluding section of that book where you come back to Freud's own position on the relation between psychoanalysis and religion, but you do have your difference from him there. I mean, I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit about that, but this is only if audience members don't have questions. Let me just make sure one thing that I think the chat is enabled and you can unmute yourselves and ask question. But if Professor Kakar, if you would like to respond to that.
Okay. I think after that, I've suggested, postulated that what is called the spiritual is one of the things which can get enhanced psychoanalytic theory, in the sense of that psychoanalysis thinks of a person as part of her bodily order, a part of the interpersonal order. So soma, which is the body, polis, which is the interpersonal with family. I think what one should add to it, that a person is also part of a cosmic order. So cosmos should become the third one. What would cosmos mean? That cosmos has two elements. One is let's say, the more earthy. So which is the connection, human connection to plants, animals, everything which is around one, the environment. So that we are part of our environment too. And I think that is coming more and more. I always wonder whether there's also in Europe, America, but here also some of it, the unrest or the feeling of the upsetness with the climate change is part of somewhere feeling that our connection in the cosmic order is being disturbed unconsciously. So that would be the earthy part of it. The other part is the more spiritual or the mystical, is that one is connected to the cosmos in another way, that there is, first of all, there is a connection to it, which would of course mean looking at what is, which goes against most, not all of it, most modern neurobiological, etc., where consciousness is supposed to be as a byproduct, not a byproduct, an epiphenomenon of brain processes. No brain, no consciousness. And now there is, of course, the spiritual or the mystical always has been, that putting into modern words would be that the brain is only a filter, that the consciousness is spread and it becomes through the filter to become individual consciousness. And that filter has psychoanalytic, you can put it, aggression, sexuality and all, and becomes individual consciousness. But there are people where this filter, this connection can be bypassed and connection, and that's where the mystics come in, where that individual filter is bypassed. So that would of course mean a change in the psychoanalytic, completely materialistic one into that acceptance of that. Even if psychoanalysis does not accept, although there is, I think, a lot of evidence which I try to give of the part of human being part of the cosmos, but okay, spiritual is always difficulty, and of course it goes back to the hostility of Freud towards religion. Again, Freud was not hostile to religious experience, which is what mystics, he is okay with it. He is only hostile to religious dogmas and beliefs, and I agree with him there. So there is no difference there. But he would not, is indifferent or leaves that aside, the spiritual connection. But I think the earthy connection, the earthy part of the cosmos can be, it can be accepted, and it changes a lot. If one accepts, now, what is the goal, generally goal of psychoanalysis is free of inhibitions, or to come to a kind of functioning, autonomous functioning, free of irrational inhibitions which come from past, etc. So it is a very individual goal. If one had the cosmos also part of it, connections to others, connections to this, then the goal would become not only an autonomous individual, but also caring individual, because I am so much connected to it. So a sexual disturbance would not be if I become only sexually potent or sexually not frigid, okay, but as long as it is also an experience of sexual intimacy with the partner, so the partner is included. Food, it goes on, it starts changing it. So that would be my current position.
Thank you so much, Professor.
Sorry to interrupt, but I think the chat box is still disabled.
Yeah.
It is enabled now, and that's why, let me just check this once. It is enabled.
It is disabled, Arka.
It was, but now it's enabled, it seems. I'm looking at the security icon.
I don't know.
Okay, just give me a second. Just give me a second. I think it should be enabled.
Now it's enabled. Yeah.
Now it's enabled, yeah.
So may I ask a question?
Megha, please go ahead.
Yeah, okay. I would ask a question from my personal experience. I have been hugely impacted by my religion and my culture. So it often happens that it requires a lot of psychoanalytic reading and understanding the concept of psychoanalysis to be able to answer a lot of subtle questions that arise to solve identity. I would not call it crisis, but questions regarding my identity and to be able to understand it. So it happens that to be able to pursue the course that I am in right now, I am not able to get an access to the guru that you talked about. So what is your opinion and what is your thought about studying psychoanalysis and understanding psychoanalysis in the absence of such a guru for some time, maybe?
I think Anurag answered it with Andre Green saying that you cannot really study psychoanalysis that way. But I mean, no study is worthless. I mean, it starts you off thinking about things, reflecting upon it. Whether just studying of books can any effect on change you, that is difficult. You see, what we have is, since we have survived so long on what we are, the change is always a danger. What happens? Because there is always a fear. If the change, what will happen if I change? As they say, the only one who loves change is a wet baby. Nobody else likes change. So you do need some kind of a place. It doesn't have to be a psychoanalyst. I mean, it happens with gurus also all the time. A place where you think you are safe, your fears are going to be contained, and what is going to happen is something good. So the hope is greater than the fear. And for that is the guru itself or the psychoanalyst is really not an important, I mean, he or she is just a way for you to go on that journey and to be able to go on that journey and change it.
Thank you so much, Professor Kakar. There are two questions in the chat box. Let me try and relay that to you. The first one is pretty long, but if I could make a gist of that. The question comes from Vedant, who's asking about your views on Lacanian thought and the structuralist return to Freud in Lacan. And he ends the question by saying that Lacan also makes use of Hindu theories and myths like the Tao of Prajapati and Dhwani to elaborate on psychoanalytic thought. If you have an observation on Lacan's use of religion or myths, perhaps. Yeah.
This is a very short answer because my ignorance of Lacan is is as great as his contributions. His contributions are. I really am a complete novice, but my interest in Lacan was of not the Hindu theories, but of course the which I thought was also the mystical, the real, from the imaginary to the real. How one does that. Lacan's, that is, I think, the French part much more through the language, and in the Indian one, it would be through silence much more and through surrender much more than the language. Language is, there is all the, or many mystical saints don't trust language. Not Lacan, but I think it's French psychoanalysis in general. The trust in language is so much, which I do not share, but I don't know enough about Lacan. Very respect him, but respect him without knowing him. So that actually. And I have to go at 6:30, unfortunately. Because
can we take this last question, Professor Kakar, or otherwise we could stop here? There's one last question in the chat box, and this is a short one. It's about the difference in the, let me just read it out. There's a difference in the limits of human potential between Indian spirituality and psychoanalysis on how far can self-transformation go. Can you please share your view on it? This comes from Himanshu Vaidya.
Yeah. Kind of jokingly, I used to say that psychoanalysis is the BA, and then the MA is further. I mean, if you want to understand yourself, first you have the bachelor's degree, and then you go on to the master's degree in the spiritual disciplines, whether it's Hinduism, Buddhism, etc. That was my joking way of saying that is so. But the thing is, I don't think they can be shortcut unless you're, of course, a very religiously talented person, spiritually talented person who can do these shortcuts. Just like in psychoanalysis, many of the early psychoanalysts, I mean, Freud didn't have any psychoanalysis himself, but, or Bose or others. So those, the very talented ones, the adepts, whether psychological or spiritual, they can shortcut that process. But mostly, I don't think so. If you want, generally, if you want to go further in self-understanding of what self is more and more, I don't think you can go to the MA without doing the BA first. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor Kakar and Anurag, for this wonderful conversation. I know Professor Kakar has to leave now. Let me just hand it over straight away to Professor Sengupta for closing remarks. Over to you, Madhumita. Thank you.
Thank you, Orko. Thank you so much for your own words of introduction. But big thank you to both Professor Kakar and Dr. Mishra for agreeing to come to Dialogues and for this wonderful conversation. I wish we could have continued for another half an hour or so, but then Professor Kakar has to go. I'm sure there are many more questions that are remaining that have not been asked. People wanted to ask them, but anyway, at least thank you for being there and listening to the conversation. All the guests who have joined us today. As I said, it's a great way to begin Dialogues this semester, and I hope we will continue to have more such events in the the remaining days of the semester. Thank you once again. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for your hospitality. Thank you for having us. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.